The advantage of having a keynote speaker who's already spoken is I don't really need to introduce him. He hasn't changed at all since this morning. Mr. Yechury is going to give a keynote speech, and he's going to speak, astoundingly enough, on the 12th five-year plan.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you very much for this opportunity, and I thank the Stanford Center for International Development for once again inviting me for this annual conference. Last year, when I was invited for the first time, I did not articulate, but I had a lurking notion in my mind as to wondering as to who's more courageous, the Stanford for inviting me or me for accepting the invitation. I think we are both courageous, so I'm back here again to share my points of view. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. We are discussing the 12th plan, and I'm intensely aware of the misconceptions that often occur regarding our attitude towards the reform process both globally and in India. My only request is to consider what I will want to say on the basis of the strength of the argument rather than on these misconceptions, which are mainly misconceptions, I would only underline. We've heard in the morning that the 12th plan has been approved by the Union Cabinet, but is not yet been discussed by the National Development Council, which is the authority to finalize the plan. And therefore, largely, we have to go by what has been put forward in the approach paper. And I suspect there's going to be very little difference between what is there in the approach paper and what will finally be the final outcome. But the fact that it has been delayed and it had to roll out from April 2011 itself indicates that there's been a shift in the definition of planning in India. Under the reform process, planning has emphasized the dismantling of controls, the diluting of regulations, and facilitating private investments. I have nothing against facilitating private investments. I mean, they are absolutely necessary. But the planning process should dovetail such investments to the larger social good and the larger social benefit, which is what the interventionist concept of planning initially was all about, which we discussed in the morning session. And the fact remains that the approach paper focuses essentially on the sustenance of a high growth trajectory and accelerating this growth, and at the same time being inclusive. As far as the high growth trajectory is concerned, we've heard again in the morning. I'm sorry for the overlap because this is bound to happen, but the growth targets have been downscaled, and it's now brought down to between 8.2 to 8.4%. As far as inclusive growth is concerned, the emphasis is in relation to reduction of poverty, increase in employment, providing universal education, and healthcare. However, I believe inclusion in the true sense can only be attained when interventionist efforts are made to ensure that the bottom percentiles receive a greater share of growth. That we'll have to work out. The plan will have to work out how that can be done. Let's take up the inclusive part of the approach on the 12th plan. First, there's considerable controversy on the levels of, I would say, ridiculously low levels of definition of poverty in India. But leaving that apart, the government of India in 2011 submitted a status report to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which spoke of the fact that the target of halving the population below poverty is, I quote, slow or almost off track, unquote. According to the official statistics, a calorific intake of 2,200, and as I said in the morning, we go by the minimum basis for sustenance, go only by the calorific intake. We find, despite the Planning Commission's definition of 2,400, the official yardstick of 2,200 and 2,100 in rural and urban India. If you take these calorific intake, 69% in rural India and 64.5% in urban India could not consume this. But what is worse, in 2009 and 10, these percentages increased to 76 and 68 respectively. In terms of employment, the last official largest survey conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization of India shows that for people above 15 years of age, all employment, including self-employment, grew at an annual compound rate of 0.82% between 2004 and 5 and 2009 and 10. For the earlier 5 years, this was 2.7%. So this decline is actually very worrisome. And when the economy was growing at a rate of around 8%, there was a decline in employment in the manufacturing sector. Now, with regard to poverty, again, the health question is directly related to poverty, and we have, and I've given the statistics in the paper that circulated, that we have reported a very disturbing trend of increasing number of people who are suffering from perfectly controllable diseases. And the World Health Organization has said that as many as 24% of the TB cases in the world in 2009, additional TB cases, have come from India. Therefore, how do you achieve universal health care according to the inclusive aspect of the plan document? And here the 12th plan proposes to move from a mixture of public sector service provision plus insurance to a system of health care delivered by a managed network. This is the shift that is being suggested now. Such a universal provision, which is proposed, of health care envisages two components: preventive interventions, which the government would be both funding and universally providing, and clinical services at different levels, defined in an essential health package, which the government would finance but not necessarily directly provide. So therefore, the government under the 12th plan proposes to confine itself to providing a small package of services, while virtually all clinical services would be opened up for the corporate sector. The government would thus play the role of provider of health care, which is financed by public monies, to fatten, I would say, the corporate sector by handing over profit-making clinical services. This is actually a plan of winding up the universalization of public health. And the proposals is to increase the expenditures on public health from 1.02% to 1.58% of the GDP. This is far less than what the WHO suggests of at least 5% of the GDP. World Bank in 2010 had ranked 200 countries in terms of expenditures for universal health care, and India stands at number 187. And what Sojit Bella was attributing to me as my figure, that is the figure from the chair of the Planning Commission's expert group on universal health care, who estimated 30 to 40 million people annually going below the poverty line because of rising health costs. So inclusive growth in terms of health, in terms of poverty reduction, we've seen unemployment, we've noted. Now take the case of education. The education emphasis on extending private education and developing education sector on the basis of a public-private partnership, the PPP we discussed in the morning. Various new legislations are pending before the Indian Parliament to this effect. The plan document, and this is what is worrisome, the plan document calls for a change in treating education as a non-profit making institution and to permit large-scale profit generation in the sector. The financial squeeze on the existing public education system is accompanied by permitting privatization. As a result, private higher education today already accounts for 4/5 of enrollment in professional education and 1/3 overall. Ironically, in this country, the United States of America, less than 1/4 are enrolled in private institutions. The universal right to education, international experience shows, can only be achieved through a network of state-run neighborhood schools. This laid the foundation of all developing countries. Unfortunately, the 12th plan seems to abandon this approach. Thus, in terms of inclusive growth in all these four areas, poverty reduction, employment expansion, universal public health, and universal education, the emphasis seems to be facilitating private, not investment, but I would say private profiteering. And this, I don't think, is in India's interests. Now come to the high growth trajectory. There are serious problems in the plan prescriptions. The focus is on providing capital, both foreign and domestic, a larger access for profit maximization. Fine, under capitalism, The state is meant to create such opportunities, and we cannot really dispute on that aspect. But will this serve the objective of achieving higher growth? Unfortunately, this does not appear to be so. Take, for instance, last year, the total amount of tax concessions given were to the tune of rupees 5.28 trillion. And the entire fiscal deficit, which all of us are concerned about, of 6.9% of the GDP, translates to rupees 5.22 trillion. That is, the tax concessions given outstrip your fiscal deficit, the entire fiscal deficit. And yet, the growth in the manufacturing declined from 3.6% in July last year to 0.1% in July this year. So despite these tax concessions, you've really not been able to spur growth. So a high growth trajectory through such a policy is not really resulting in any such high growth. The basic problem in India, according to me, lies in the fact that the aggregate domestic demand in the country is not only not growing proportionally to sustain such a high growth trajectory, but on the other hand, all studies indicate that there is a contraction in recent period. Given the current global recession and the economic slowdown, world trade has declined, and so has India's volumes and values of export. We just discussed it in the last session. Any export-led growth strategy thus is not simply viable. India's growth, therefore, is crucially dependent, I believe, upon expanding its domestic demand rapidly. This cannot happen by merely making available larger and cheaper access to capital for investments. The purchasing power in the hands of the Indian people needs to be exponentially increased. For this, the 12th plan must ensure large-scale increases in public investments to build India's much-needed infrastructure. This would generate jobs and hence increase the purchasing power in the hands of the Indian people and the aggregate domestic demand. And as I said yesterday, no country in the world has actually built its infrastructure without the primary participation and role of the state. Private investments can only be supplementary. This trajectory will be more sustainable in terms of growth and relatively more inclusive as well. The financing of such public investments can come from the monies that are now not collected due to tax concessions, which in any case have not resulted in any additional growth, inclusive or otherwise. What I strongly feel that India needs today is virtually an Indian New Deal. A massive hike in public investments for which there are no dearth of resources. These resources are either being looted through mega corruption scams, reflecting a crony capitalism of the worst order, or are being given away as tax concessions. We can only hope that such a shift in strategy takes place, and by the time the plan is finally adopted. But unfortunately, I am reasonably certain that this may not happen. Therefore, the current trajectory of the reforms in the 12th plan approach naturally leads us to question growth and who are benefiting from it. During the course of last year, the number of US dollar billionaires in India doubled to 52, holding combined assets equivalent to 25% of India's GDP. Apart from, I have nothing against them, may their tribe increase. But the point is, apart from them, there are another minuscule section we call the high net worth individuals. They are just 0.1% of the total population of our country, and their combined worth is close to 1/3 of India's gross national income. The 2010 World Wealth Report brought out by financial services from Capgemini and Merrill Lynch Wealth Management, according to them, India now has 126,700 high net worth individuals, an increase of more than 50% over 2008. These are the people who have not lost during the period of global recession, but these are the ones who have gained. That growth will be accompanied by a trickle-down process, thus reducing levels of poverty continues to remain an illusion. It has never happened and will never happen unless there is an interventionist effort by the planning process. It is precisely this that is being jettisoned today. Unfortunately, this will only widen the hiatus between the two Indias that are being created. So what is required in this reform process currently, in my opinion, is to actually concentrate not only on the supply side of availability of capital for investments, but on the demand side as well, and more emphasis on the demand side in terms of what is produced by these investments can be consumed, and therefore making the Indian people capable of absorbing this consumption that investment can produce. So unless you are able to tackle this in a dual-pronged attack, I don't think the objective of a high-growth trajectory, which is also inclusive, can be achieved. So therefore, the emphasis only on one side of it, reforms for greater opportunities and greater investments, will not yield the results. Will not yield the results unless the absorbing capacity of India's domestic economy, which is the purchasing power in the hands of the people, are, as I said, exponentially increased. So it will have to be a combination of these two, and it is this combination that will have to be brought about. And that is what we hope that these discussions, and finally the discussions in the National Development Council in India, and hopefully in the Indian Parliament, if we succeed in getting it onto the table on the agenda for discussion, that we'll be able to impress on having a combination of both these aspects, looking at both sides, rather than emphasizing only on one side, which is what currently the 12th plan does. So this is the dynamics of the debate on reforms during the 12th plan in India today. And that's where you find all of us in politics taking our positions on the basis of agreeing that yes, the objective should be higher growth trajectory, which is inclusive, but how do you achieve it? In the process of achieving that objective, because so far the record has not been very bright, and so far we have not seen any interventionist actions in terms of expanding your domestic markets. And we'll discuss it tomorrow. As a result of this, what is happening is, even in those sectors where we require to urgently intervene, like in infrastructure, you have very, very big gaps and very big shortfalls. And those details I'm not going into now because we have a special session on it tomorrow, and we'll discuss those issues. Therefore, I think these corrective measures are required to achieve the stated objective of inclusive growth with a higher growth trajectory. And this is what I wanted to share with all of you. And as I said earlier, the misconceptions, leaving that apart, I only want to end with a joke. I mean, please don't offend me. It's actually a joke. It's not but a real thing. And this was once when the Venerable Pope decided to send a bishop on a goodwill tour to the United States of America. And he said, you land in New York, and when you land in New York, be careful of the media. They are notorious. So the less you speak to the media, the better. The poor bishop landed at New York, and amongst the various questions the media posed to him, one mischievous media person with a microphone and a camera, he asked the bishop, saying, Your Holiness, does your itinerary in New York include a visit to a nightclub? The bishop was blasphemous. I mean, he was totally shocked, and he said he remembered the Pope's advice, and he looked around, and they thought the less the better. So he said, oh, are there nightclubs in New York? And he walks off. The next day, screaming banner headlines were, upon arrival, the first question the bishop asks, are there any nightclubs in New York? So that is where the left, we stand as far as the reforms are concerned. So do not take us on the basis of such misconceptions and misreporting. Please understand the reasoning that we have given. And for actually achieving the stated objective of high growth and inclusive growth, I think greater state intervention in these terms is required, not only to build our infrastructure, but increase our domestic demand, which is crucial to achieve this strategy. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Now that was extraordinarily succinct. We gave you 45 minutes and you only used a bit over 15.
I thought we'll...
Quite remarkable. So you must expect an inordinate number of questions.
That's why.
Let me ask the first one.
Please.
It's interesting, this tax expenditure problem. That's what the Chinese call it. When I was in Beijing last week, in fact, at one of the fiscal institutes was telling me that there are 800 of these giveaway programs that the government is finally starting to analyse and try and work out which ones are actually significant in some way and contribute to economic growth and which are just pure giveaways. We've got a little bit of this problem, I guess, in the US, where the Republicans are going to close the deficit by closing loopholes, but they haven't yet specified which ones. Now, the question is, you're going to close the deficit, or you're going to use this money for massive new investments. Which of these, I mean, I presume that the tax concession of 528 is not homogeneous, so which are the really egregious programs that you would close straight away without even thinking about it?
Yes.
What are the others would you have to give some consideration to?
Yes.
Sorry?
Yashwanthina sheep. I mean, that should be closed. That should be closed. That could be the first one to go. Unless he's prepared to rear them to produce merino wool. No, Nick, I mean, I deliberately spoke succinctly less because I thought that there should be greater interaction. I mean, that makes better sense. But you're right, I mean, this 5.28 trillion of tax concessions is not homogeneous. And I would say that some of them, in terms of the concessions given in indirect taxes, let's say for your import tax reductions to export, to boost exports, or what we call excise taxes in India. Some of these can be rationalized and should be sustained to provide some degree of stimulus to the economy. So I am not now here suggesting that this 6.9% of the fiscal deficit, the entire amount be collected and used for public investment. A 3% fiscal deficit is considered universally as fairly healthy. You maintain your 3%. And which is what your fiscal responsibility bill also talks about. You maintain your 3%, and the excess of that is being given as tax concessions, mop that up and put that into investments. Now, that is what I would call the new Indian New Deal, which is what is required to be done. And that's when the US built its infrastructure during the New Deal, most of it, and so does India require to do that now. And that is what I meant when I said that this is the alternative that's available within the parameters of the existing figures that we have.
Let me push this just a little bit further, because we do know as well that India has these massive subsidy programs, water, power, as we heard this morning, right to work, and perhaps food, many of which are subject to pretty severe corruption, but they're very difficult to eliminate. They get a life of their own because they bring in votes. Now, they're hard to get rid of. What would make it easy, or possible even, to eliminate some of these loopholes that you refer to?
Well, that would require, you're right, I mean, there are lots of people who survive on that. I mean, not merely survive, they thrive on it. I mean, literally, I mean, these loopholes are more designed, and as I hinted in the morning, the greatest amount of Indian creativity is to identify and create such loopholes by which you can make such monies, and this is a serious problem. I mean these leakages. I mean, this is a problem that will require a political consensus across the spectrum, where we'll all have to come to things and not think in terms of just the coming elections, how to win that, and therefore not be able to tackle these problems. But I think these leakages and these things will have to be plugged on the basis of a political determination. I mean, it's not that they cannot be plugged; they can be. I mean, all of us know how they operate, but they are allowed to get away with it only because of political expediency, and that is something that needs to be done. And for that, I think, at least we have been saying, and we are prepared to do that, but there are larger people with larger stakes, I mean, who will also have to come on board. But it's only a political consensus that can do that. There are no economic measures in that.
First question. You, sir, no turn around, you're the man. Oh, you want the mic? Sorry.
Hi, I'm Bijan Khojapur from Iran. Thank you very much. I fully agree with you that when you say we have to understand the absorbing capacity of the society or of the economy when there are reforms. Have you given any thought on how you measure the absorbing capacity? Is it the trial and error approach, or is it something that you can measure? I guess some of the dimensions will only come out once the reforms are in place. So how do you measure that in advance?
You see, as I've indicated to you, if the reforms were really making a progress in terms of people below, people who are poor, the poverty, people who are unemployed, if their numbers increase in absolute terms, then the absorbing capacity naturally increases. So the measure would be the incremental improvement in terms of poverty, in terms of employment, in terms of universal health care, in terms of universal education, which are the parameters, basic parameters that the plan has really outlined. So you'll have to look at the levels of improvement. Unfortunately, now in the last decadal situation, you see them declining, not really improving.
Anthony?
Listening to you talk, I'm actually reminded of two very famous academic papers. The more recent one is the one by Kevin Murphy, Vishney et al., and it goes back to this big push argument. And the literature there has advocated, is saying exactly what you're advocating, which is basically the way out of poverty is a demand-side approach. You have to increase the middle class, and it has to come from a big push, that you really shift the demand curve substantially. The problem with that, just to see how it works out, you never know how much of a big push is required. And so the big problem that we see now is everybody is saying, okay, you made you made an investment in infrastructure, but it was not enough, and that's why we haven't got it. So you actually need to put in so and so many more billions of rupees, et cetera, into it. And that's being the argument that's forward for many developing countries. That's one big problem. How do you know, once you go down that path, it may be that there's never enough of a stimulus. You need to have more and more. And can a country like India afford that? That's the first issue. And the second issue is, of course, again, in the Indian context, once you're talking of billions and billions of rupees, you're also talking of billions and billions of rupees lost through these massive infrastructure projects. Again, is this a policy that's worth advocating until we do something about institutions that make sure that we can reduce the amount of leakage when you come to the irrigation scandal, the coal mining scandal, all the others are all big demand-driven, demand-push things which have generated no benefits at all.
Great, and let me take up your second question first, Anjali. You're right about the question of leakages, the question of all this and demand push. A lot of money going down the drain. But the point is that that has to be checked, and you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because that is happening, you cannot say that we'll abandon this demand push strategy. Now, that is a serious problem in India. I admit that is a serious problem in India. And as I said, that requires a cross-sectional political consensus to tackle it. And it's not that it can't be tackled. It can be. It can be if we are able to abandon our immediate, political gains and expediency that we may find in these issues. But your first question is more pertinent in the sense, in any demand push strategy, there's actually, you can never define the limit, because it will only keep expanding. So you have to give a limit for yourself. What is the limit that you are today saying? Yes, you have this amount of people below poverty, who are in poverty. You will increase it to this level. You have this many who are in unemployment. You will increase it to this level. So you define the levels and accordingly do the investments. Because like you said rightly, even if there's full employment, even if there's no poverty, the demand for a demand push will continue. That is elementary economic theory that all of us have been through. So you have to, at a particular juncture, when you see that this is the problem, this is going to be the millstone for India's development. Believe you, it's not lack of reforms, not lack of opening up. If there is no absorption capacity within the economy, what will all this lead to? It can only lead to, like it's happening now, rise in the prices of real estate and land, or rise in the prices of gold. These two are booming in India, because those who have money have no other place to invest. Because what they invest, what they produce, cannot be sold. Why is landed estate growing like this? Why is gold going this? Staring in your face, saying that people don't have money to buy what is being produced. So you speculate in these prices. So that is the point that we have to meet. You're right. They have to set the limits of what you want to spend for. But the other question, as I said earlier, the leakages and all, I mean, that is something that all of us will have to sit together and seriously work it out.
I don't think Angie's going to let you get away with this.
No.
I think she's going to come and attack you later on, or at least ask you to justify
Please,
some
please,
of these
please.
things a little more. But Anne is next.
Thank you. I think I'm on the same wavelength as Anjani, but a slightly different point. There's a fairly well, I want to say theorem is that's too strong, but proposition established in agricultural economics that probably applies more generally. And that is that more than half of whatever the social welfare program you're going to give out is, price supports in the United States or whatever, more than half is going to go to the top half of the income distribution.
More than half?
It goes to the top half of the income.
So that whatever you're doing is costing you more than 2 rupees per rupee that goes through to whomever your beneficiary group is. And let me take one specific case, which I know to be true in a lot of countries, I believe to be true in India, but you're more of an expert than I am, and that is you referred to health care and the private clinics. In my understanding, in many countries, the doctors don't show up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, whereupon they charge the fees for the public patients. Now, to the extent that's true, and it's certainly true to some extent, there is an interesting question as to whether, indeed, the money isn't better spent in part on the preventive part you mentioned, but in part on other income-generating alternatives, more education, and so on and so forth. And from what I hear from you, you're saying there's inadequate demand in India. I don't think that's true. We know there's inflation. We know other things. There is certainly room for shifting within the Indian public budget and otherwise and getting a different allocation. And what I hear you saying is more on some things like infrastructure. Wouldn't you go further and say that a lot of that money has to come from some of these subsidies that are going where they shouldn't go and go to things like education that will increase the opportunities for the poor?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as far as education and opportunities for the poor, I mean, increasing that's what. Yeah, I mean, that's what. I mean, what I've argued here is part of the money that you're giving off as tax concessions can be siphoned off. Part. I'm not talking the whole. And I said maintain at 3% and not more fiscal deficit. The rest that is going in, you siphon it off. The second thing is, you're right, in any such, I'm not really talking in terms of doles, neither am I saying there's a shrinkage of demand in India as a whole. The purchasing power in the hands of the vast majority of Indians is what is low. Now, there is a demand in India for, because of the huge size of India and the Indian people. I mean, let's say even 200 million is larger than most of the, or if not all of the European countries. I mean, if there is demand from 200 billion, it looks like a huge demand, but from 1.2 billion, if you just imagine if you can give that purchasing power to at least another 400, 600 million, I mean, what would be the base of the pyramid that you're creating? And it's possible to create that. It's not that it's not possible. It's possible to create that, and that's exactly what I'm saying. And that would lay the basis for a high growth trajectory as well as inclusiveness. But you're right in saying that the poor gets 1 rupee, the rich or the richer sections get 2 out of the 3 rupees that has been spent. But remember by your own experience, by everybody else, investments in infrastructure will not only build the infrastructure but also create huge amount of jobs. You know that much better than anybody else. And we've had the experience. I mean, that's why I use specifically the term New Deal. I mean, we've known the experience here of how infrastructure was built and how the economy was revived. There are various ways of doing it. Hitler did it in a different way, through militarization. that was one way. But the biggest stimulus in India, unfortunately, is when we have our elections. And the amount of money that flows through the elections is the biggest stimulus package that can be given. And that's why we were saved, because we had the 2009 elections in the midst of the global crisis, when billions and trillions of Indian rupees flow into the system.
So is the solution to have elections
every year? No, that's what no, but I'm saying that indicates the fact that if you're able to pump in money, you are able to sustain the economy.
Now, Shad.
So I wanted to come back to your point on growth being crucially dependent upon expanding domestic demand. As you know, we have this universal identity scheme, which is meant to give every Indian a unique identity. And this unique identity is intended to be a platform where, for example, one could provide direct cash transfers, which could then leave it to people to decide what they want to actually spend their money on. So I was just doing some sums. And the sums say, I think, that if you say that India's GDP is little over $1 trillion today, somewhat more, if you say that we have about 10% of GDP being provided in the form of subsidies. So if one were to simply scrap all of the subsidies, all of them, and provide it as a direct cash transfer to 500 million people, let's say, let's be very generous about, or take the 700 million figure of the Communist Party even, and then no subsidies, direct transfers, and that would be a tremendous, precisely what you're advocating here, tremendous expansion of domestic demand, because you would now have 500 million or 700 million people that would have, I think it's about $2,000 more each, yeah, which is a substantial number. Would you advocate something like that? Because this would be a way of actually achieving directly what you're advocating in your...
Yes, in fact, this is a... Thank you, Naushad, because this is a point that is being very actively considered and discussed in India today. But there is only one such, the one point, and which is a forceful point, that cash subsidies ought to be and should be linked also to the inflation index. Otherwise, with an inflation rate now of the food articles roughly, which is around more than 10% always for the last 3 years. Now, any cash subsidy that goes in, let's say, for food security that you're wanting to give. Now, if that is not indexed to inflation, over 6 months, what you're giving to the person is not sufficient to sustain themselves. Now, that is where the debate is stuck in India, whether to index it. Because less than 7% of the India's working population, which is in the organized sector, gets this inflation indexed, what we call the earner's allowance. Now, 93% do not. Now, if the cash transfers are linked to this such an inflation index, which is perfectly possible, then what you're saying is perfectly correct. But that is what is the point of contention at the moment. At the moment, that is the point of contention, whether food stamps or direct cash subsidies, etc. But link it to an inflation index. And particularly now, at a time when all the essential commodities prices have been on a rampage for the last 3 years, virtually. So if that is done, I think it will be a perfectly viable thing. And what you say is right. That's exactly what will. It's virtually like having an election. No need of having it every year, but it can be every month.
This has always appealed to me greatly. I mean, we've seen these sorts of programs working quite well in Latin America. 2 aspects of it. One is that conditional cash transfer has been tied to mothers taking their children for health checkups or making sure they go to school. So it's not unconditional in that sense, but you'd argue, well, it makes it more of a merit good transfer. The other argument that I find very appealing is that it removes the poor from the sorts of pressures to give up some of the money that accompanies most cash transfers. I mean, it's not just the officials that may want to take a percentage, but as somebody pointed out in Latin America, that the union official knows the day that they begin to hand out the cash transfers, and they wait outside and ask for their union dues as the people leave the office, and usually they've got 2 fairly large people there with them, and often people find it politic to pay. Who wants to ask the next question? Sajid.
There's another problem in India, Nick. I mean, it's not only the union taking away shares. Sorry, Sujit, 1 minute. But you also have a problem where families, where the women do not want such cash transfers because they say the husband takes the cash and brings it out. Then what I mean, they are very such social problems, but these are larger issues that need to be tackled. Yeah, sir.
Not surprisingly, your speech has a number of radical conclusions, and I want to highlight some of them. One is that most places, if the poor consume less calories, or if the population consumes less calories, that's considered a sign of progress. And so please explain why you consider
Progress?
it a sign of increase. It's a movement from potatoes to meat, and therefore you will have less calories. The second, you've got a very, very radical conclusion where you say inclusion in the true sense can only be attained when interventionist efforts are made to ensure that the bottom percentiles receive a greater share of growth. So can you answer whether you think in China there's been inclusion because the bottom percentiles haven't increased, haven't received a greater share of growth? A greater share of growth means that inequality goes down. So if you can point to any society on this planet that has achieved inclusion in the true sense that you would like India to achieve. Then there are a couple of statistics. India's contributed 24% of the new global cases of TB. Now, most people recognize that TB is not there in the developed world. So 24% is exactly our percentage in the developing world. Then you have on healthcare that we are only on healthcare we're only spending 1.5% of GDP. What you most likely do know is that the private sector spends 5% of its income, or 5% of GDP on healthcare. So that makes it 6.5% that India is spending on healthcare. Then what Nick asked in the beginning on this concessions, etc., these outstripped 5.28 trillion. The corporate sector pays a 24% tax rate, which is one of the highest in the world.
33.
Exemptions come to 30. The exemptions are what you are calculating in this as tax concessions, and that explains that. Last but not least is the simple point that one man's crony capitalism is another woman's crony socialism.
Thank you, thank you.
You don't have to respond to the last bit. See if you can deal with the
No, I don't know what Sujit is preoccupied with, the men's crony capitalism or women's crony socialism. Huh? I mean, I would suspect it's the latter. I mean, that apart. But as far as in which country of the world has the inequality declined, Sujit, that is not my concern. I know I can make it decline in India, and I want to do that in India. If you want your justification that nobody in the world has done, therefore let us not do it in India. I'm sorry, I don't share that. I mean, I disagree with that. I disagree with that. Which statistics, we can discuss that separately, but what is happening there. But the point is, if we can do it, the justification is not that no other country has done it, therefore we should not do it. I'm sorry, I don't agree with it. Number two, you're saying that when calories decline, people's health improves. It's like George Bush telling us that India and China are eating too much and therefore the global prices are increasing. No, I mean, it's a ridiculous argument. I mean, I'm here talking of a subsistence level of calorific intake. I'm not talking of obese people reducing their calories. My concern is not obesity. My concern is people with hunger. And what is the minimum requirement they require, according to all scientific studies, the lowest minimum. And I'm talking in those terms that these are the numbers. And number three, none of these numbers are mine. They are your official figures. So don't attribute motives to me for quoting official statistics. Everything, what do you mean CAG is official? It is. I mean, that is what the whole country is seized of today. I mean, if you disagree with it, I mean, you have the entire right. Like a woman's crony socialism, you can disagree. But the point is, these are official statistics that are provided in our country, and on the basis of which we base our arguments. And what was the other question?
Health percent, 6.5% spent on health.
Yeah, the whole point is, look at what is happening in India today. When we talk to the PPP, I mentioned it in the morning, therefore I didn't repeat it here. You have private educational institutions where the state has now declared that 25% of the seats would be earmarked for economically backward students, and the government will pay the fees to the private institutions. That is, government will pay the fees to the private institutions, and the government, instead of opening government schools or neighborhood schools, will pay the private schools. You have these private hospitals, where 10% of the beds must be reserved for poor people, whose costs will be paid by the government to the private hospitals. Government will not open a national health scheme, We will not have a national health service, but that will subsidize the private sectors by saying that I'll pay you, you treat so-and-so. I don't think that's healthy at all. And I don't think that, I mean, the 5% that you're talking of the private thing, of that 20% comes from government directly subsidizing in this manner. So therefore, you just, I mean, look at it realistically. What are we addressing in India? And what is our objective? If you want to really make the Indian economy grow, you have to address the problem of its absorption, which means actually increasing the purchasing power of its people. If that cannot be done, any degree of investments that go will not really produce any results. What Naushad said is one particular way of doing it. I mean, that's what I said, well, what is the issues that we are discussing in terms of whether linking it with the inflation or the other. But the point is, you cannot miss the wood for the trees and say that, woods for the trees and say that such a problem just doesn't exist. It does. Why are farmers committing suicides? Why is malnutrition the highest? Why does the Indian Prime Minister say it's a national shame that the levels of malnutrition in Indian children? No, I mean, these are the realities. No? You have to tackle these realities. And that is, I mean, this is the only way I think we'll be able to do that. Yes, I got it.
I wasn't going to let you speak, Nadir, but now that you've got the microphone, fire away.
Agreeing with some extent with Sitaram and with some extent with Surjit. So what I would like to say is there's a moral imperative to reduce poverty in India. It's possibly economically desirable if we find the right interventions. We are going to have another session today about what might be the right interventions for reducing poverty. And if these are high return investments, then there is always enough money in the budget to finance them because the economy itself will grow if we find these right interventions. So the real challenge is to find what these right interventions are.
Absolutely.
That's a pretty good last word on which to finish. We don't want to erode the time available for the afternoon sessions. So all we need to do is thank you.
But can I, before that, just complete the story of the Pope and the Bishop? It'll just take me a minute. So the next day,
he's in the nightclub.
No, he's not in the nightclub. Next morning, he's very aghast at looking at the papers. Then he goes to start his lectures, and he makes an appeal saying, are there any media persons in the audience? And some hands go up. He says, listen, you see, I come from a small village a town in Italy. So my repertoire of anecdotes and stories is very limited. So please don't repeat my stories, because if you repeat them, nobody is going to come for my next lecture, because that's the same thing I'm going to say. So the next day morning, what is the headline? The bishop tells many stories, all unprintable. So therefore, I mean, take me on the reasoning that I've given and not by motivation. So thank you.
That's a pretty good story.